welcome to the Astronomy Management Case Study Pre-Scene Analysis. My name is Peter Stiff, and I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm the head of publications here at Astronomy, as you can see, and during my time here I've written several mock exams both for us and for other institutions, as well as writing exams for CIMA. Now, I've also been a case study marker, and this extends from the old T4 syllabus to the new case studies, and that's at all levels: operational, management and strategic. I've also written several of the study texts that we use here. Now, if you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Facebook icon with my Facebook page there. Now, if you wish to find out more about me, more about astronomy, and just general more about the pre-scene, I'll be posting various hints and tips throughout the run-up to the exam on that page. So what are you going to get in this pre-scene analysis? What do the videos cover? Well, first of all, we'll go through the pre-scene section by section, and we'll be bringing up all the key points, analysing them. What will this mean for the company? What likely things could come up in the exam based on this? And then we'll do a full strategic analysis at the end that will cover all the various models, such as 5 forces, SWOT analysis, pestle analysis, various things like that, and strategies too. And finally, we'll conclude with my top 10 issues. Now, this will be based on the pre-scene and based on what has happened in previous case study exams. So this is the top 10 issues that I think will be very likely to come up in the actual exam. So that should help give you some, help prepare you for those. Now, how will this work? As I've mentioned, when we go through it section by section, I'll be assuming that you have no prior knowledge. So basically, I'll be assuming that you haven't read the case study and that you're going through it with me at the same time. Now, I will mark out certain sections that I'd like you to read, and then we'll go through them together afterwards, because obviously there'll be things that I've picked out that you haven't picked out, or even things that you've picked out that I haven't picked out. So it's the combined knowledge of us together. And as I mentioned, we'll go through a strategic analysis at the end. So how to approach the pre-scene? What should you be taking from the pre-scene? Well, it's the context of the company. It's the background information that prepares you for the exam. Now, it's worth noting that you shouldn't pre-write anything based on the pre-scene. You shouldn't look at it and think, oh, there's definitely going to be a question on this because of all this information in the pre-scene. I'll just write that question out several times, remember it, and regurgitate it in the exam. That is not the case. The pre-scene is just information to help you come up with your answer when you see the question, when you see the unseen material presented in the exam. It is not, you cannot pass the exam by simply learning the pre-scene word for word, because you will have to bring up other information as well. So just a bit here, just this note at the end, that your recommendations must be consistent with strategic analysis. That's just a tip that many students fall down on, is that sometimes they change their mind in their conclusion. And so when you read the case study and you think, oh, the industry must be, the competitiveness of the industry must be strong because of X, Y, Z, don't then say there isn't a strong competitive industry when you're answering an exam based on something you've seen in the unseen. So let's move on to the pre-scene now. As you know, it is on Scent, a perfume company in the fragrance industry. Now, let's start by looking at the first page. Well, obviously, it's a good place to start. And the first thing you should note here is that you are a financial manager. Now, this may seem quite arbitrary to just give you a title, but that's not the case. The new CIMA exams are supposed to be analogous to real employment, real life situations. So when you are answering questions, you should be thinking to yourself, I am a financial manager. What would a financial manager in your respective organization, in this organization, what would they do? So let's move on to this first page then, this first plot of text. Now, it's common for students to look at the first page and just think it's all very general, generic background information. It's not important. They skip over it, trying to get to the more meaty bits, such as the financial statements later in the pre-scene. But that's not the case. If we look at this first page, it's loaded with information that will give us a grounding on the company going forward throughout the pre-scene and in the exam itself. So first sentence here, Scent is one of the world leading perfume houses. So we know it's not a small organization, we know it's a big, powerful company. It's already one of the market leaders. So that kind of information is relevant, as we know we have clout in the industry. And then it goes on to say that our head office and manufacturing facilities are located in Zealand, but our products are exported globally. Now, think about that. Obviously, it will be easy for us to sell and to transport goods in Zealand, but what happens when we export globally? Now, are there significant transport costs involved? You know, if Zealand is in one side of the world and one of its largest markets is on the other side of the world, is that going to be a huge transport expense to export globally? And also you have to remember, when dealing with different countries and different cultures, is that they may be different. What works for one may not work for another. For example, the perfume and the fragrance industry, you could argue, is quite a highly sexualized product, particularly in the UK and in the US and things like that. The adverts are very provocative, and that, while that works here, that may not work in a Middle Eastern country, for example, where advertising and products and all that sort of stuff is, and just culture in general, is much more conservative. It's and it's much more modest. So that's something that the company has to be aware about when exporting over the world. Now we move on here. We can see that the company was established 70 years ago by two brothers, and they are quoted on the National Stock Exchange. Now, this is very important, as a company that is publicly traded on the stock exchange will have to adhere to far more regulations and rules that they must be followed, because of course they are rules designed to protect shareholders who will rely on the quality of your information as a basis for their investment. And so of course, if you don't comply with them, you could get into trouble. And what this also means is that the company cannot simply make decisions for itself all the time as if it were a limited company. No, if it's publicly traded and owned by shareholders, then the shareholders must approve decisions made by the board of directors. And also here, some of the shares are still owned by the descendants of the founders. Now, the important thing about this is that they're probably, although no makes indication, we can almost assume that they've probably got quite significant holdings if they are the descendants of the founders, and also they have a very key interest in the running of the business. So if you were to look at our Mendelow's matrix of stakeholders, we would probably include these as key players. because they have a lot. They'll probably have a lot of power and will have a key interest. They may, in fact, be quite a nuisance to the board. Not necessarily, I don't mean that in a horrible way, but the fact that they are probably quite ingrained in the company and ingrained in the culture of how the company has operated for the past 70 years. And so any changes they might meet with resistance, or they might resist any changes, sorry. So moving on, scent manufacturers a wide range of branded fragrances, and this includes a various range for both men and women, and also different levels of fragrance. So perfumes, obviously, the stronger, the more high value product, and then the cheaper products such as cologne. Now, it's worth noting here that it only has 3 major factories anyway. Now, this in itself may not be a particularly bad thing, but from a perspective of meeting demands, if those 3 factories are at capacity, if suddenly there were to be a demand for their products, would they be able to meet demand from those 3 factories? And also this could be seen as almost a risk factor as well, both from the point of view that I've just said, and also for if something were to happen to one of those 3 factories, would they be able to meet demand from the only 2 remaining factories? You know, do these factories make different products? And if the demand levels were to change from one product to the other, would one be able to scale back its production of a certain product and make another, or are all the machines based purely to designed purely to produce that particular product? So we see here that fragrances are considered part of the cosmetics industry. Now, the cosmetics industry obviously is a much larger, broader industry that produces things like makeup and other things like that, hair dyes, etc. Now, the key player in this larger cosmetics industry is L'Oreal. So that could be an interesting fact for you when you're doing some of your own research in preparation for the exam. But what L'Oreal does might be considered something that it might be a good idea to suggest that scent does something similar, because L'Oreal are the leading player. Now, it says here that customers, or consumers, regard fragrances as a luxury. Now, looking back on your CO4 economics paper, if you can remember that far, or if you did that paper, it's worth noting that luxuries are usually things that people don't buy if money is tight, or things that they do buy when money is no issue. But it also says that the consumers used it on a daily basis, which is unusual because a luxury item would usually be a special thing, a one-off thing. And also here it says that they're not particularly sensitive to economic trends. So what we can read from this perhaps is that whilst it is considered a luxury, it's considered a luxury that certain people want and will have, and certain people don't want. You know, whoever wants it will buy it regardless of their money situation, and whoever doesn't want it won't buy it regardless of their money situation. An interesting note here is that during the Second World War in Britain, when particularly money and resources were very tight, fragrance sales weren't particularly affected, as the people who had the money to afford it still bought it, because it's just considered one of these things that people who want it want to have it and will have it. As you can see here, that the fact that it's used as gifts is often means that it's not particularly susceptible to economic trends, but you could argue that it may not be an issue in recession, but it may be an issue for seasonality. When do people purchase gifts? People purchase gifts for Christmas. Christmas is only at one time of year, so it could be that there is a build-up in sales later in the year. Also, things like wedding anniversaries. Now, a majority of weddings happen in the summer, so it could be that during the summer there is a rise in sales as a result of people buying them as gifts for wedding anniversaries. So moving on now to this issue here about the revenues of the perfume industry. It's worth noting, yes, that it's 30 billion Zealand dollars a year. So we can see that that's quite an incredible amount for what really is just spraying a scent on yourself. And it's also worth noting that this is not showing any signs of slowing down. In fact, the perfume industry is expected to grow to about 45 billion by 2018. So yeah, the market is only going up at the moment. So I'll just as well give you a quick breakdown of the kinds of regions, the regionality of perfume. Well, currently the US is by far the largest market. It incorporates a third or around a third of all sales. However, Europe and Asia are a close second, who each command about a quarter of the market share. Although the fastest growing country actually in this industry is Brazil. And the sales in Brazil are expected to grow to about 5 billion by 2018. So that's just a key bit of information you may want to keep at hand if there's ever a question in the exam about the growth of the industry or the suggested areas in which scent could move into. And the final paragraph here just mentions is more about the product and the brand positioning. In fact, that many people who can't afford the clothing enjoy the brand by purchasing the fragrance. Now, a great example of this would be something like Louis Vuitton or Prada, where clothes cost thousands and thousands of dollars, but the perfumes only cost $100. So it allows the average person to experience the brand. And this is what drives, and it's worth noting that it could be what drives sales. It's rather than companies focusing more on perfume. For example, here, where it says that 85% of revenues came from perfume sales, you may look at that and think, well, from a product probability and revenue point of view, why even bother making these expensive clothes if 85% of your revenue comes from sales? Well, that's all part of the brand experience. You need to push the unobtainable clothes so that you push the brand, and thus then you offer the cheaper alternatives as the perfumes at the end. Now, if you just marketed it and if you just went into perfumes, you may lose that branding. So moving on to the next page here is just a bit of information about Zealand itself. Now, as you can see, Zealand operates in the Zealand dollar, but of course, as we know from earlier, it exports globally. So other things you bring in here is economical factors. So if you were doing a pestle analysis here, for E, for economical, we would bring in currency. currency risks perhaps, or just general currency transactions. So if Zealand is dealing, if one of its largest markets is a market where the Zealand dollar is very weak, that could cause issues, cash flow issues, revenue issues going forward. So you could bring in possible strategies over how we pay our overseas clients. Do we lead or lag our currency? And then, of course, as I already mentioned earlier about being a traded company, they have to, or they are suggested to adopt the International Financial Reporting Standards, which of course they do. So we now know that they do, or they have at least stated that they will comply with them. So moving on now to the location of Zealand's offices. Now Zealand's office is based, Cent's office, sorry, is based in the Zealand capital city. And now we have no indication of how large Zealand is or how large its capital city is, but the fact that it's based there often means it's based in a larger pool of talent, as it were. Now if you were to take the UK, the fact that a company is based in London over a more rural part of the country usually means that it's opening itself up to a larger pool of staff, a larger pool of talent. So that is a good thing as well. If there is a question on recruitment in the exam, you could argue that by being placed in the capital city, which particularly will be attractive to younger graduates, etc., that is a positive, that's a strength of the company in its location. If we were doing a SWOT analysis here, you could say that the location is a strength. It's something that the company has to offer. Now moving on to the final paragraph on the second page, we hear about the climate of Zealand. Now the climate of Zealand is ideal for the industry it operates. It's ideal for growing flowers, which is a cornerstone of the perfume industry, or at least was a cornerstone of the perfume industry. But as we can see here, that they have diversified, or some companies at least, it doesn't expressly mention whether Zealand have or not, have diversified into importing ingredients and also from producing synthetic substitutes. Now, the issue with importing is the same as when we were talking about exporting earlier. There are risks involved, such as transport cost or transport risks. If a ship were to sink with thousands and thousands of dollars worth of ingredients, then that could have a real detrimental effect on your business and on your manufacturing. And likewise, particularly if your factories or your fields where you grow your flowers are set up in quite rural areas of your country, and then you end up sort of shutting them down in favour of importing stuff, it could cause social or cultural issues within your country. And of course, synthetic substitutes arguably will probably be cheaper, but will they be as good? And will customers or consumers, like the fact that you're using synthetic substitutes? It's a very big thing. It's a very sort of social trend to like natural things. Natural food in the supermarkets. They advertise the fact that they don't use added ingredients, things like that. So that's some issues to think about as we march forward through this case study. So we'll go on to the next page now, which is one of the first kind of bigger specific parts of the segments of the case study, and this is all about the manufacturing process. So this is how we manufacture and the process of which we get products in from our suppliers and how we get them out to our buyers. Now, as we can see here, comprise an aromatic compound derived from a natural source. But also we know it can also be derived from a synthetic source. Then it goes on to say about how flowers and plants are often grown specifically for this purpose, for this harvesting purpose. Now, that could be considered a bit of an ethical issue insofar as it's, growing plants simply to chop them down, cut them down and process them into scents for perfumes. Now, so in addition to that ethical issue with the plants, there's also the far bigger ethical issue of using them from animals. Now, case in point here is Ambergris, which is one of the biggest and most expensive, most finest components of perfume, is actually a product of a sperm whale's digestive system. Now, don't ask me how someone decided let's try and see if the product of the digestive system is going to smell nice when we mix it with things, but that is besides the point. Now, this is a big ethical issue because, of course, people are all about the fair treatment of animals these days. There's a lot of pressure groups, pressure groups such as PETA. Now, that could be a big thing for the business if it were to use animals and protest groups and pressure groups were to complain about it. It would look bad on the media. There you can foresee the news stories of Scent does this with animals just to make its perfumes, things like that. It would have a real negative effect. And it's also worth noting that ethical issues are a huge part of the new CIMA syllabus, and so CIMA really does like to examine them, and it really likes to drive home the point that acting with strong ethics is very important. Now, it moves on to say about synthetic compounds being manufactured. Now, this is all well and good, but of course it can cause issues with skin issues, dermatological issues. Now, synthetic compounds are often made out of lots of different chemicals, and people do not necessarily know the exact effects of them all. But it's worth noting that the perfume industry, or the fragrance industry, is regulated by the Department of Food and Drugs, or the FDA. As well as being internally governed by the International Fragrance Association and the Research Institutes for Fragrance Materials. Now, this is relevant because it does mean that if the fragrance company wants to keep trading, or it has to comply with certain rules and regulations. So this, again, in our PESTLE analysis, would be L for legal. There are certain legal requirements that they must meet to continue trading. So other than this, why else would a company want to use synthetic materials? Well, as you can see in the next two paragraphs, it talks about the advantages of synthetic materials. They can be much more consistent, and this is because that plants are obviously made of nature, from a natural thing, and so many natural things can impact that, such as the way they've been grown and the weather in that location. Now, that wouldn't do to a global business like Scent, if every few batches of flowers it got were tainted and so it didn't smell right. You would have to end up either just scrapping them all and cutting down on production for that period, or you would have to release a product that doesn't fit your generally high standards of quality. So that is an issue there. But we can also see that the cost is a huge saving here. In fact, what does cost 5,000 Zealand dollars per kilogram of natural substances can cost only $400 in synthetic substances. And so this also will save a lot of staffing issues as well, as you can see here that it takes over 1 million flowers to be hand picked on the morning that the flowers first open. Now, if you can imagine a field of 1 million flowers and how they all have to be picked on that exact morning, the mobilization of staff or farmers, things like that, for that particular morning must be an astronomical expense. And that is reflected here in this $5,000 per kilogram. So what you can take away from that is the fact that synthetic things are perhaps the safer option. They are cheaper and they are more consistent. However, it could be that they're not quite as good, as in they can't quite, science has only gone so far to fully clone a unique natural scent. And as you can see here, that Scent would not be the first company to do this, as many fragrance houses have switched from natural ingredients to cheaper synthetics, and often without telling the public that, telling the consumer that. So I suppose that is an ethical issue as well, as in, are you lying to people by initially marketing these high-end perfumes as natural, but then secretly replacing the ingredients and not explicitly telling people that you've done that? So that could be another ethical issue there. Or it could just be that that's just part of their cost-cutting processes. Now, a very important point here is contained in this one little sentence here, that many of the compounds used by Scent are scarce and difficult to obtain. Now, this, to me, rings alarm bells of supplier issues. Now, what if Scent relies heavily on a particular company to provide it with a certain material for one of its most popular and most profitable fragrances? Now, what if that company were to go bust, were to not be able to provide that season's round of materials, things like that? Now, the reason why I say this is because supplier issues are a big topic, and in the case study exams there's been several instances throughout T4 and from the new syllabus where they've asked you what to do with certain suppliers when suppliers are in risk of going bankrupt or in risk of not being able to provide the materials you need, and which options you can use going forward. A lot of the time the standard options to think about are the do nothing option of just waiting and see what happens, or to diversify your supplier portfolio. Now, in many of these instances, one supplier provides a huge amount of the materials to the company in the case, and obviously the issue with that is that if something happens to that company, that's a huge amount of your supply lost. But obviously the flip side to that is that by having a good, strong relationship with one individual supplier, you can often get large discounts, you can often be sure of the quality, sure of payment, things like that. Whereas if you've got many different ones, some ones might be good, some others might not be, and you're less likely to take advantage of these those economies of scale that you get with the large supplier. Now moving on now to the breakdown of the product. Now as you can see, there are three main ingredients: alcohol, water, and the aromatic compound. So this is that natural or synthetic scent, the key ingredient in the fragrance. And as you can see, much larger quantities of oil are found in the more expensive fragrances compared to the cheap ones. That's obviously, what makes them cheaper is because the ethanol, the alcohol, and the water is what dilutes it. And so the more oil you have, the stronger the scent. And as it says here, the reason why it is watered down is to avoid harming the wearer's skin. Obviously, alcohol can harm your skin in its purest form, and so can these aromatic oils. So the reason why this is important, it relates back to this supplier issues bit here. And the way I can foresee this is being some sort of limiting factor question. Now, what they could do in the exam is give you a piece of unseen material talking about an issue with suppliers. Now your main supplier can't provide, or can only provide, X amount of oil. And then they also may give you a breakdown of the profitability and the demand for each product, and ask you, how can we mitigate our losses? How can we make the best of this situation? And it could be that, for example, your demand for this product here is far higher than this product here, but then the price obviously for the high quality product is much more than the low quality. So it may give you some, obviously you won't be asked to do a limiting factor analysis, as in the case study exam there is no calculations, it's worth pointing that out, but it may ask you to assess some calculations that have already been done, and that in fact is a very common thing in the case studies. So it could be that we have to decide on how many of each product we can make, because we can't fulfill the demand for all of them, but we can say fulfill 80% of orders. So which 80% do we do? Do we have an even split of sales that we don't make on each of these three, or do we do as many cheap ones as we can, as many mid ones as we can, and then the high quality one takes the loss? For example, here we can see that the aromatic compound of the high quality one is 5 times as high as the cheap one. Now, does it sell for 5 times as much? And is the demand for the cheap one 5 times the high quality one? Now, without knowing this information, we can't say which one is best to do. But of course, you also have the kind of non-financial indicators here. So the loss of the high quality perfume may have a more detrimental effect on customers, particularly if you're working with a large department store who, only stock the high quality one, and then they get all upset, whereas your low one could just be sold in lots of smaller independent pharmacies and drugstores. So there's lots of issues we have to think of there, but I can see that as a real, take away from this as a real potential issue that could be brought up in the exam. So now we move on to the final paragraph on this here section on manufacturing, and this is to do with the actual production of the products. Now it says here that in this particular paragraph that a particular range, the range handle, is comprised of a lot of the same ingredients, except for just a higher concentration. So what this brings to mind is joint costing or joint manufacturing. So all these all these particular items here, the bath oil and the perfume and the eau de toilette, etc., are all basically comprised of the same ingredient until the end, where certain additional products are either added or not added. So you can see, for example, they could all be being produced together, and then the eau de toilette is finished. The perfume has a bit more of the aromatic compound put in, and the bath oil has another thing diluted into it to stop it from diluting, as it says here, in bath water. So that's also an issue here, which also ties into your supply issues, as in, if, for example, the eau de toilette is not in high demand in the handle range, but the perfume or the bath water or the bath oil is, then you really can't just say, well, let's not just stop producing the eau de toilette because it's all part of the process. Or it could be the opposite, as in, well, it can easily be transformed. The amount we set aside for the eau de toilette can easily be transformed into one or the other by adding the additional ingredient. And that, of course, could also be a question in the exam, as in, it could say to you, we suggest that we get rid of the eau de toilette range to improve the bath oil or the perfume part of the handle range. So, and then you may be given some information, and you have to come up with a reasonable recommendation as to why they should or shouldn't do that. It's also worth noting that you could also talk about this handle range as a gift set, as it were. Now, gift sets, you may have seen them in the shops before, certain boot stores and things like that, where they have a shower gel and a perfume, and all from the same company, all in the same brand, in the same package. And it's also worth noting that last year, 20% of sales in the perfume and industry were on gift sets. So you could also suggest here, if it isn't, we haven't had any information alluding to it yet, that this particular range, as it's being produced together, as it comes under a joint costing, why not expand the range even further by adding another gift set, by adding a gift set which actually comprises the three together, and that could really help increase profit on that range. So that brings us to the end of this sample video. I really hope you've enjoyed listening as much as I have enjoyed presenting, and hope you found it useful. Now, if you'd like to know more on the pre-seen videos and on other products and services that Astranti provides, please look online at www.astranti.com. And as I mentioned at the beginning, please like my Facebook page, Peter Stiff Astranti, as I'll be providing more and more free hints and tips that you'll find useful on the run-up to the exam. So once again, thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your studies.